The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, each droplet exploding like tiny bombs against the glass that separated Richard Blackwood from the world below. Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? He stood motionless in his corner office, hands clasped behind his back, watching the ant-like figures scurrying through the streets of Manhattan. At 58, Richard commanded an empire worth $3 billion, built from nothing but ambition and an iron will that had never bent, not even when life had tried to break it in half. Yet tonight, something gnawed at him from within, a restlessness that all his wealth couldn't soothe. His reflection stared back from the rain-streaked window, revealing a man who had everything money could buy, but whose eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had lost something far more precious along the way. The Armani suit fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, the Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, and the leather shoes cost more than most people made in a month. But beneath the veneer of success, Richard felt like a fraud, a man who had climbed so high that he could no longer remember what the ground felt like beneath his feet. The intercom buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood, your car is waiting downstairs," came the crisp voice of his assistant. Richard nodded to no one, straightening his tie as he prepared to descend into the world he had spent decades rising above. Tonight was different, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Something in the air felt charged with possibility, as if the universe was preparing to remind him of truths he had buried beneath layers of success and cynicism. The elevator descended in silence, carrying him down through the floors of his empire, past the trading rooms where millions changed hands with the click of a mouse, past the conference rooms where deals were struck that could make or break entire companies. As the numbers decreased on the digital display, Richard felt a strange sensation, as if he were traveling not just down through his building, but backward through time itself. Richard Blackwood hadn't always been a billionaire. 43 years ago, he had been Ricky, a scrawny 8-year-old boy living in a cramped apartment above Murphy's Diner in the Bronx with his grandmother Eleanor. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 3, leaving him with nothing but a small silver locket that had belonged to his mother, and the fierce love of a woman who worked double shifts as a seam lady just to keep food on their table. Elena Blackwood was a force of nature despite her tiny frame, standing barely 5 feet tall, but possessing a spirit that could fill entire rooms. She had immigrated from Ireland as a young woman, with nothing but hope and determination, building a life from scratch in a country that didn't always welcome her kind. Her hands were permanently stained from years of working with fabrics and dyes, and her back was bent from hunching over sewing machines. But her heart was pure gold. She would wake up at 4 in the morning to prepare breakfast for Ricky, then work until midnight to ensure he had everything he needed. "Money isn't everything, my boy," she would tell him as she tucked him into bed, her Irish accent still thick despite decades in America. "But kindness, that's the real treasure. You remember that, Ricky? No matter how high you climb in life, never forget where you came from, and never forget to help those who need it most." Ricky would nod solemnly, clutching the silver locket she had given him, the last connection to the mother he barely remembered. Inside was a tiny photograph of his parents on their wedding day, their faces glowing with hope and love. Elena had worked extra hours for months to buy him a chain so he could wear it close to his heart. "This will keep them with you always," she had whispered, fastening the chain around his small neck, "and it will remind you that love is the only thing that truly lasts." Those were the happiest years of Richard's life, though he wouldn't realize it until decades later. Elena would take him on long walks through the neighborhood, pointing out the small acts of kindness that happened every day. The corner store owner who gave free bread to hungry families, the postman who always had a kind word for everyone, the nurse who volunteered at the community clinic. She taught him to see the world, not through the lens of what people lacked, but through the beauty of what they gave to others. But happiness, Richard learned early, was a fragile thing. When he was 15, Elena was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors said it was from years of breathing in dust and chemicals from her sewing work, but she never complained, never expressed bitterness at the unfairness of it all. Instead, she used her remaining time to pour even more love into her grandson, working longer hours, despite her failing health, to save money for his education. "I won't be here to see you become the man I know you're meant to be," she told him one evening as they sat together in their tiny living room, her frail hand holding his. "But I want you to promise me something, Ricky. Promise me you'll use whatever success you find to make the world a little bit better. Promise me you'll remember that we're all connected, that helping others is the only way to truly help ourselves." Ricky promised, tears streaming down his face, clutching the locket that had become his most precious possession. 3 months later, Elena was gone, and with her went the last traces of warmth and love in his world. The foster system was a cold, brutal teacher. Ricky bounced from home to home, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections, never trusting anyone enough to let them close. The locket became his secret, hidden beneath his shirts, the only reminder that love had once existed in his life. By the time he turned 18 and aged out of the system, something fundamental had changed within him. The boy who had once believed in kindness and connection had been replaced by a young man who trusted only himself and believed that money was the only real power in the world. Richard threw himself into his studies with single-minded determination, earning a scholarship to Columbia University and then an MBA from Wharton. He worked 100-hour weeks, clawed his way up the corporate ladder, and made his first million by the time he was 30. Each success felt like armor, protecting him from the vulnerability he had felt as a child. He told himself he was honoring Elena's memory by becoming successful. But deep down, he knew he was running from the pain of losing her. The locket disappeared somewhere along the way. Richard told himself it didn't matter, that clinging to the past was a weakness he couldn't afford. He bought bigger apartments, faster cars, more expensive suits. He dated supermodels and socialites, but never let anyone get close enough to truly know him. He built walls so high and thick that eventually even he forgot what was on the other side. By his 40s, Richard had everything society said should make him happy, but he felt more alone than ever. He would lie awake at night in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering when success had started feeling so much like failure. The boy who had once seen kindness everywhere now lived in a world where everyone wanted something from him, where genuine human connection felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. The limousine glided through the rain-soaked streets, past the familiar landmarks of his childhood neighborhood, though Richard barely recognized them now. Gentrification had transformed the area, replacing the small family businesses with chain stores and luxury condos. Murphy's Diner was still there, though, a stubborn holdout against the tide of change, its neon sign flickering in the darkness like a beacon from another time. Richard found himself giving the driver an address he hadn't spoken aloud in over 20 years. "Stop at Murphy's Diner on East 149th Street. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "You sure, Mr. Blackwood? That's not exactly your usual kind of place." Richard stared out the window at the modest diner, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the cold night. "I'm sure." He had no idea what had possessed him to stop here. He told himself it was curiosity, a momentary whim brought on by the strange mood that had gripped him all day. But as he sat in the back seat, watching ordinary people hurry past the diner's windows, he felt something stirring within him that he thought had died long ago. The bell above the door chimed as Richard stepped inside, and immediately he was transported back in time. The smell of coffee and bacon grease, the worn vinyl booths, the black and white checkered floor, everything was exactly as he remembered from his childhood visits with Elena. For a moment, he was 8 years old again, tugging on his grandmother's hand as they found their favorite booth by the window. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a few late-night customers scattered across the worn booths and a lone figure behind the counter. Richard chose a corner booth, sliding across the cracked vinyl seat that had probably been there since his childhood. His $1,000 suit felt absurdly out of place in the humble surroundings, and he found himself loosening his tie, trying to blend in with an environment that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. A young woman approached his table, and Richard looked up to find himself staring into the kindest eyes he had encountered in years. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a face that radiated genuine warmth. Her uniform was clean but worn, and there was a tiredness around her eyes that spoke of long hours and hard work. But when she smiled at him, it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but confident. "I'm Maria. Can I get you something to drink to start?" Richard found himself studying her face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. There was something about her demeanor, a gentleness that reminded him of someone from long ago. "Coffee, please. Black." Maria nodded and returned with a steaming mug, setting it down with careful precision. "Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes with the menu?" "Actually," Richard said, surprising himself with his honesty, "I used to come here as a child with my grandmother. I was just remembering." Maria's expression softened, and she slid into the seat across from him without invitation, a gesture that would have annoyed him in any other context, but somehow felt perfectly natural here. "That's beautiful. This place has so many stories in its walls. My grandmother worked here for 30 years before she retired. She always said diners were like second homes for people who needed one." Richard felt his chest tighten at her words. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Maria said, her voice taking on a wistful tone. "She raised me after my parents died, taught me everything I know about taking care of people." She paused, studying Richard's face with those perceptive eyes. "You look like you could use some taking care of tonight." The observation was so gentle, so lacking in judgment or ulterior motive, that Richard felt something crack inside his chest. When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen not his wealth or his power, but simply a human being who might need comfort? "I'm sorry," Maria said, apparently mistaking his silence for offense. "I didn't mean to pry. You seemed sad. And my grandmother always said that everyone who walks through those doors is carrying something heavy." Richard took a sip of his coffee, buying himself time to process the unexpected emotions swirling within him. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a lot like mine. She used to say similar things." Maria's face lit up with genuine interest. "Really? What else did she used to say?" For the next hour, Richard found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in decades. He talked about Elena's wisdom, her kindness, the way she could make their tiny apartment feel like a palace with nothing but love and determination. Maria listened with the kind of attention that had become extinct in Richard's world, asking thoughtful questions and sharing her own memories of her grandmother in return. "She sounds like she was an incredible woman," Maria said after Richard finished telling her about Elena's final days. "I bet she'd be so proud of the man you've become." Richard's laugh was bitter, surprising them both. "I'm not so sure about that. I think she'd be disappointed in what I've turned into." Maria tilted her head, studying him with those wise eyes. "What makes you say that?" Richard found himself telling this stranger things he had never admitted to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. He talked about his loneliness, his isolation, the way success had somehow hollowed him out from the inside. He spoke about the promises he had made to Elena and how thoroughly he felt he had failed to keep them. "You know," Maria said when he finished, "my grandmother used to say that it's never too late to find your way back to who you're meant to be. She said that sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely before we can remember who we really are." Richard felt tears prick at his eyes, and sensation so foreign that it startled him. "I don't even know who that person is anymore." Maria reached across the table and, without asking permission, placed her warm hand over his cold one. "I think you do. I think that's why you're here tonight." Before Richard could respond, Maria excused herself to check on her other customers. He watched her move through the diner, refilling coffee cups and chatting with the late-night regulars, treating each person with the same warmth and attention she had shown him. There was something almost magical about the way she moved, as if she carried light with her wherever she went. When she returned to his table, Richard made a decision that would change everything. "Maria, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, settling back into the seat across from him. "If you could change anything about your life, what would it be?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn table surface. "Honestly, I'd find a way to go back to school. I was studying to be a teacher before my grandmother got sick, had to drop out to take care of her and help with the medical bills. She died 6 months ago, and now I'm working here and at a grocery store just to keep our apartment and pay off her debts." She looked up at him with a small, sad smile. "But that's life, right? Sometimes we have to sacrifice our dreams to take care of the people we love." Richard felt something powerful stirring within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in decades. Here was a young woman who had given up her own dreams to care for someone else, who worked multiple jobs just to stay afloat, yet still found the energy and kindness to comfort a lonely stranger in a diner. She was everything Elena had tried to teach him to be, everything he had forgotten in his climb to the top. "What kind of teacher did you want to be?" he asked. Maria's eyes lit up with a passion that transformed her entire face. "Elementary school. I love working with kids, helping them discover that learning can be fun. I had this idea for a program that would help kids from low-income families get the support they need to succeed academically." She laughed self-consciously. "I know it sounds naive, but I really believed I could make a difference." "It doesn't sound naive at all," Richard said, and meant it. "It sounds like exactly what the world needs more of." They talked until the diner began to empty out, their conversation flowing like water, finding its natural course. Maria shared her dreams and fears, her memories of her grandmother, her struggles to make ends meet while still trying to help others in her community. Richard found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing not just his successes, but his regrets, his loneliness, his sense that he had lost his way. As the clock neared midnight, Maria began the closing routine, wiping down tables and preparing the diner for tomorrow's customers. Richard watched her work, noting the care she took with even the smallest tasks, the way she made sure everything was perfect for the next day's guests. "I should let you get home," Richard said, standing and reaching for his wallet. "Thank you for listening, for treating me like a human being instead of a bank account." Maria looked puzzled. "Why would I treat you like a bank account?" Richard paused, realizing that he had never told her who he was, what he did for a living, or anything about his wealth. To her, he was just another customer, another person who needed some kindness at the end of a long day. The realization hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had seen him as simply Richard, not Richard Blackwood the billionaire? "You're a good person, Maria," he said, leaving a $100 bill on the table. "Don't let the world change that." Maria picked up the bill, her eyes widening. "Sir, this is way too much." The coffee was only $2. "Keep it," Richard said, heading toward the door. "You've given me something far more valuable than coffee tonight." As he reached the door, Maria called after him, "Wait! I don't even know your name." Richard turned back, and for a moment he was tempted to tell her the truth. But something held him back. "It's Rick," he said, using the nickname Elena had called him. "Just Rick." Maria smiled, and something about her expression made his breath catch. "Well, just Rick. I hope you'll come back soon. You seem like you could use a friend." Richard walked back to his waiting limousine in a daze, his mind reeling from the evening's unexpected encounter. As the car pulled away from the curb, he found himself looking back at the diner's glowing windows, already planning his return. Over the next several weeks, Richard found himself making excuses to visit Murphy's diner. He would tell his driver to take different routes home from work, routes that just happened to pass by the familiar neon sign. Sometimes he would stop in for coffee and pie, sitting in the same corner booth and talking with Maria during her breaks. Other times he would simply drive by, watching through the windows as she served customers and wondering what it was about her that had awakened something he thought was dead inside him. Maria never pried into his personal life, never asked about his expensive clothes or his obvious wealth. She treated him with the same genuine kindness she showed everyone who walked through the diner's doors, and Richard began to understand that this wasn't an act or a strategy. This was simply who she was. She had been shaped by love and loss, just as he had, but while his experiences had made him hard and cynical, hers had made her soft and giving. During one of their conversations, Maria mentioned that she had been trying to save money for a small down payment on an apartment closer to the community college, where she hoped to eventually resume her studies. The building where she currently lived was being sold, and the new owners were raising the rent beyond what she could afford on her diner wages. "I've been looking at places," she told him one evening as she refilled his coffee cup, "but everything decent is so expensive. I might have to move further out, which would mean longer commutes and higher transportation costs. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just chasing an impossible dream." Richard's heart ached listening to her struggles. Here was a woman with so much to offer the world, being held back by the simple mathematics of poverty. All his wealth, all his power, and he sat there helpless as she worried about affording a basic apartment. That night, Richard lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the cruel irony of his situation. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, more than enough to solve all of Maria's problems with a single phone call. Yet he couldn't find a way to help her without revealing who he really was. And somehow, he knew that the moment she learned about his billions, everything would change between them. The genuine connection they had built would be contaminated by the power imbalance, by her gratitude and his guilt. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Richard made a decision that would test everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The idea came to him fully formed, like a gift from some hidden part of his psyche that still remembered Elena's lessons about kindness and justice. If he couldn't help Maria directly, perhaps he could help her indirectly. And in the process, maybe he could start to understand what had happened to the compassionate boy his grandmother had raised. Richard began what he privately called the experiment. Using resources from his various companies and charitable foundations, he started quietly investigating the situations of Murphy's Diner's regular customers. What he discovered both broke his heart and fueled his determination. There was Tom, the night security guard who came in for coffee during his break, who was working 3 jobs to pay for his daughter's cancer treatments. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who ordered the same cup of tea every evening, who was choosing between her heart medication and her rent each month. There was Jake, the college student who made a single slice of pie last 2 hours while he studied, who was surviving on 1 meal a day because his financial aid hadn't come through. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of quiet desperation that surrounded the diner, and Richard began to understand that Maria wasn't unique in her struggles. She was simply one of millions of good people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. But Maria was different in one crucial way. She seemed to know everyone's story, and despite her own struggles, she was constantly finding small ways to help. Richard watched in amazement as she accidentally made too much food and offered it to Jake for free, as she let Mrs. Rodriguez sit in the warm diner long past closing time when the weather was bad, as she listened to Tom's worries about his daughter and somehow always knew exactly the right thing to say. "How do you do it?" Richard asked her one evening. "How do you keep giving when you have so little yourself?" Maria considered the question seriously, stirring sugar into her own coffee cup as she took a rare break. "My grandmother used to say that we're all just walking each other home. We're all scared, we're all struggling with something, we're all just trying to make it through another day. When you help someone else, you're not really helping them. You're helping the part of yourself that knows what it feels like to need help." Richard felt that familiar crack in his chest, the sensation of ice beginning to thaw around his heart. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." She was. But you know what the funny thing is? She learned most of her wisdom from someone else, another woman who worked here years ago, back when my grandmother was young and new to the country. This woman took her under her wing, taught her about kindness and community. My grandmother always said she owed everything to this woman's example. Richard felt his blood turn to ice water. "What was her name, this woman who helped your grandmother?" Maria smiled, her eyes taking on that soft, distant look that came when she spoke of people she loved. "Elena. Elena Blackwood. My grandmother said she was the kindest person she ever met." The coffee cup slipped from Richard's numb fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor and sending hot liquid splashing across the tiles. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence as Richard stared at Maria, his world tilting on its axis. "Are you okay?" Maria was already moving, grabbing towels to clean up the spill, her voice full of concern. "Did you burn yourself?" Richard couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare as Maria knelt beside his chair, carefully wiping up the spilled coffee. Elena. She had known Elena. Their grandmothers had worked together, had been friends, had shared the same wisdom about kindness and community that they had both passed down to their grandchildren. "I'm so sorry," Richard managed to whisper. That name." Maria looked up at him from where she knelt on the floor, and her expression changed from concern to something deeper, more knowing. "You knew her, didn't you? Elena Blackwood." Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. Maria sat back on her heels, studying his face with those perceptive eyes. "She was your grandmother, the one you've been telling me about." It wasn't a question, and Richard found himself nodding again, tears beginning to blur his vision. Maria rose slowly, disappearing into the back of the diner for several minutes. When she returned, she was carrying something small and silver in her hands, something that made Richard's heart stop beating entirely. "My grandmother left this to me when she died," Maria said softly, holding out a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. "She said it belonged to Eleanor, who gave it to her for safekeeping, along with instructions that it should find its way back to Eleanor's family someday. She said Eleanor had a grandson who had lost his way, and that when the time was right, this would help him find his way home." Richard's hands shook as he took the locket, the familiar weight of it settling into his palm like a missing piece of his soul sliding back into place. It was his mother's locket, the one Eleanor had given him as a child, the one he had lost somewhere in his climb to the top. But how was that possible? "I don't understand," he whispered. "I lost this years ago. How did your grandmother?" Maria settled into the seat across from him, her voice gentle but sure. My grandmother said that Elena came to see her shortly before she died. She was very sick, but she insisted on making the trip. She brought the locket and a letter, asking my grandmother to promise that if she ever met Eleanor's grandson, she would know him by his loneliness and his lost look, and she would give this back to him. Richard's fingers fumbled with the locket's clasp, and it sprang open to reveal the tiny photograph of his parents, their faces unchanged by the decades that had passed. But there was something else inside, a piece of paper so small he had to squint to read Eleanor's familiar handwriting. "For my Ricky, when you remember who you're meant to be." The tears came then, years of suppressed grief and longing pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. Richard sobbed as he held the locket to his chest, feeling the walls he had built around his heart crumble into dust. Maria reached across the table and took his free hand in both of hers, holding him steady as decades of pain and isolation flowed out of him. "She knew," Richard whispered when he could finally speak again. "Somehow, she knew I would lose my way, and she knew I would find you." Maria squeezed his hands gently. "My grandmother always said that Elena had a gift for seeing what people needed before they knew they needed it. She said Elena could look at someone and see not just who they were, but who they were meant to become." Richard looked up into Maria's kind eyes and saw Eleanor looking back at him, saw the same wisdom, the same unconditional love, the same absolute faith in the goodness that existed within every human heart. "What did she tell your grandmother about me?" "Aunt, she said you were the kindest little boy she had ever known, but that life would try to make you hard. She said you would have great success, but that success without purpose would make you sick in your soul. And she said that when you were ready to remember who you really were, you would find your way back to the places where love lived." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the truth of Elena's words settle into his bones. He had been sick in his soul, poisoned by isolation and cynicism, dying slowly from a lack of connection to anything meaningful. But somehow, through a miracle he couldn't begin to understand, he had found his way back to love. "Maria," he said, opening his eyes to meet her gaze, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning." Over the next hour, Richard told Maria everything about his wealth, his empire, his power, his loneliness. He told her about the man he had become and the boy he had lost, about the promises he had made to Elena and how thoroughly he had failed to keep them. He waited for her expression to change, for the genuine warmth in her eyes to be replaced by the calculating look he had grown so accustomed to seeing when people learned about his money. But Maria's expression didn't change. She listened to his confessions with the same attention and compassion she had shown from the beginning, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry you've been so lonely," she said finally. "That must have been terrible, having all that success, but no one to share it with." Richard felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Aren't you angry that I lied to you about who I was?" Maria considered this, tilting her head slightly. "Did you lie, or did you just tell me a different truth? Because the man I've gotten to know these past weeks, the one who listens and asks questions and cares about other people's stories, that's Rick, isn't it? That's who you really are underneath all the rest." Richard stared at her, understanding in that moment why Eleanor had chosen her grandmother as a keeper of secrets, why the universe had conspired to bring them together in this small diner at this particular moment in time. Maria saw him the way Elena had seen him, not as a collection of achievements or failures, but as a human being capable of both great love and great pain. "I want to help you," Richard said suddenly. "Your school, your dreams, everything you've had to put aside. I want to make it possible for you to become the teacher you're meant to be." Maria smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. That's very kind of you, Rick, but I can't take your money. It wouldn't be right. Why not? I have more than I could ever use. Elena always taught me that we're supposed to help each other. Because, Maria said gently, I need to earn my way. I need to know that my success comes from my own efforts, not from someone else's guilt or pity. Richard felt frustrated, desperate to find a way to help her without diminishing her dignity. It's not guilt or pity. It's what Elena would have wanted me to do. Maria leaned forward, her voice kind but firm. Elena would have wanted you to help people, yes, but she would have wanted you to help in a way that honors their strength, not their weakness. She would have wanted you to create opportunities, not dependencies. Richard sat back in his booth, stunned by the wisdom in her words. Even in this, Maria was teaching him something essential about the difference between charity that empowers and charity that diminishes. Eleanor had been right about her. She was exactly the kind of person who could help him find his way back to who he was meant to be. Then tell me how, Richard said. Tell me how to help in a way that honors your strength. Maria was quiet for several minutes, and Richard could see her thinking, weighing possibilities and consequences. Finally, she looked up at him with a spark of excitement in her eyes. The community college where I want to finish my degree. They've been trying to start a program for adult learners who need flexible schedules and financial support. Low-income parents, people working multiple jobs, students like me who had to interrupt their education. The college has the curriculum designed, but they can't get funding for the support services, childcare, transportation assistance, emergency financial aid for when life gets in the way. Richard felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand where she was going with this. If someone were to endow that program, Maria continued, it would help hundreds of people like me get the education they need to build better lives for their families. It wouldn't be charity. It would be investment in human potential. That's brilliant, Richard said, his mind already racing with possibilities, but it's also not enough. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. What if we didn't just fund one program at one college? What if we created a foundation that could replicate this model at schools across the country? Maria's eyes widened. That would help thousands of people. Tens of thousands eventually, maybe hundreds of thousands. Richard felt a familiar energy building within him, the same drive that had built his business empire, but this time directed towards something meaningful. We could call it the Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for Educational Opportunity. We? Maria asked, raising an eyebrow. Richard looked at her across the table, this remarkable young woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was praying. I can provide the funding and the business expertise, but I need someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone who knows what these students really need. I need someone who can make sure we're helping people find their strength, not just giving them handouts. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and Richard held his breath, waiting for her answer. I have one condition, she said finally. Anything. We start here with the people in this diner, this community. Before we try to save the world, we prove we can help our neighbors. Richard felt something click into place inside his chest, a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in decades. Deal. Over the next several months, Richard threw himself into the work of the foundation with the same intensity he had once devoted to building his business empire, but with a crucial difference. This time, he wasn't working alone. Maria became his partner in every sense of the word, bringing her deep understanding of human needs to balance his strategic thinking and financial resources. They started small, just as she had insisted. Richard quietly paid off the medical debts that were crushing Tom, the security guard, and then offered him a position as the Foundation's first community liaison. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself mysteriously selected for a pilot program that provided free prescription medications to seniors, never knowing that Richard had personally funded the entire initiative. Jake, the struggling college student, received a scholarship that covered not just his tuition, but his living expenses, allowing him to focus on his studies instead of working multiple jobs. But the real transformation wasn't in the lives they touched. It was in Richard himself. Working alongside Maria, seeing the world through her eyes, he began to remember the lessons Elena had tried to teach him about connection and purpose. The lonely billionaire who had walked into Murphy's diner that rainy night was slowly being replaced by someone who looked remarkably like the compassionate boy Elena had raised. Maria insisted that they spend time in the communities they served, not just writing checks from Richard's penthouse office, but sitting in the same humble spaces where people struggled and dreamed and hoped for better tomorrows. Richard found himself in church basements and community centers, listening to stories of hardship and resilience that broke his heart and rebuilt it at the same time. "You're different," Maria told him one evening as they walked through the neighborhood where he had grown up. "Lighter somehow, like you're carrying less weight on your shoulders." Richard smiled, his fingers unconsciously touching the locket that now hung once again around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt but always present against his skin. "I feel like I'm finally remembering how to breathe." They were standing outside the building where Eleanor's apartment had been, now replaced by a sleek condominium complex that Richard could have afforded to buy with pocket change. But instead of bitterness at the gentrification, he felt something else, a sense of continuity, as if Elena's spirit lived on, not in buildings or places, but in the work he and Maria were doing together. "She would be proud of you," Maria said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Richard turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had somehow reached through decades of cynicism and isolation to pull him back to himself. "I think she would be proud of both of us." 6 months after that first night in the diner, the Eleanor Blackwood Foundation had grown beyond anything Richard had initially imagined. They had funded educational programs at 12 community colleges, provided emergency assistance to over 300 families, and created a network of support that was transforming entire neighborhoods. But more importantly, at least to Richard, they had created something he had never thought possible, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Richard still lived in his penthouse, still wore expensive suits, still commanded his business empire with the same strategic brilliance that had made him billions. But now, those things felt like tools rather than defining characteristics, means to an end rather than ends in themselves. He had found a way to use his wealth and power in service of something greater than his own success. The Foundation's first major success story came in the form of Sarah Chen, a single mother who had been working as a night cleaner while trying to complete her nursing degree. Through the Foundation's support, she was able to quit one of her 3 jobs and focus on her studies, graduating with honors and landing a position at one of the city's top hospitals. At the graduation ceremony, she sought out Richard and Maria to thank them personally. "You gave me back my future," she said, tears streaming down her face as she hugged them both. "Not just mine, but my daughter's too. She gets to see her mother become someone who saves lives instead of just someone who cleans up after other people." Richard felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched Sarah reunite with her family, her nursing cap slightly askew and her face glowing with pride and possibility. This was what Elena had tried to teach him, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the futures you made possible, the hope you helped kindle in hearts that had almost given up. But it was Maria who provided the Foundation's most profound transformation. Working alongside Richard, she had blossomed from a struggling waitress into a passionate advocate and brilliant strategist. Her natural empathy, combined with the education she was finally able to complete through night classes, made her an unstoppable force for positive change. Watching her grow into her full potential was perhaps Richard's greatest joy. "I have something to tell you," Maria said one evening as they sat in their usual booth at Murphy's Diner, reviewing applications for the Foundation's newest scholarship program. Richard looked up from the papers spread between them, noting something different in her tone. "What is it?" Maria smiled, that radiant expression that had first captured his attention all those months ago. "I got accepted to the graduate program at Columbia. They're offering me a full fellowship to pursue my master's in education policy." Richard felt his heart soar and break at the same time. "Maria, that's incredible. That's exactly what you've been working toward." "It is," she said, but there was something hesitant in her voice. "But it would mean leaving the Foundation, at least for the 2 years of the program, and leaving here." She gestured around the diner that had become so central to both their lives. Richard reached across the table and took her hands in his, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "You have to go. This is your dream, your chance to make an even bigger impact on the world. But what about the Foundation? What about our work together?" Richard smiled, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since childhood. "The Foundation will be here when you get back. And our work together isn't ending. It's evolving. You're going to learn things at Columbia that will make you an even more effective advocate. You're going to meet people who share our vision. You're going to come back with ideas and connections that will help us change the world." Maria studied his face, searching for any sign of the abandonment fears that would have consumed the old Richard. "You really mean that, don't you? You're not just saying what you think I want to hear." "I mean it completely," Richard said, and realized it was true. The desperate neediness that had once characterized all his relationships had been replaced by something healthier, the ability to love someone enough to want what was best for them, even when it meant letting them go. "Elena didn't raise me to hold people back from their destinies. She raised me to help them find their wings." 2 months later, Richard stood in the small crowd gathered outside Murphy's Diner for Maria's going-away party. The entire neighborhood seemed to have turned out. Former scholarship recipients, community college administrators, local business owners who had partnered with the Foundation, and dozens of people whose lives had been quietly transformed by Maria's kindness and Richard's resources. Tom, the former security guard who now ran the Foundation's community outreach program, raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To Maria, who showed us all what it means to turn your pain into purpose, your struggle into strength." The crowd cheered, and Richard found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been one of the loneliest men in the world, surrounded by wealth but starved for meaning. Now, he stood among people who knew his story, who had seen him at his most vulnerable, who valued him not for his money, but for his commitment to their shared mission. After the formal festivities ended, Richard and Maria found themselves alone in the diner, sitting in their usual booth as the autumn sun set outside the windows. The space felt charged with all the conversations they had shared, all the dreams they had planned, all the lives they had helped transform together. "I have something for you," Richard said, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a small velvet box. Maria's eyes widened. "Rick, if that's what I think it is." "It's not," Richard said quickly, though he couldn't deny that the thought had crossed his mind many times over the past months. "At least, not exactly. Open it." With trembling fingers, Maria opened the box to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a key. Engraved on the key were the words, "Elena's legacy." "It's beautiful," Maria whispered. "But what does it mean?" Richard took the necklace from the box and moved around the table to fasten it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. It means that wherever you go, whatever you accomplish, you'll always have a key to come home. It means that you're not just Maria anymore. You're the keeper of Elena's wisdom, the guardian of everything she believed about kindness and connection and the power of human love. Maria turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that what we've built together isn't just a foundation or a partnership. It's a legacy. Elena's legacy, continuing through us and through everyone we touch." Richard cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the woman she had become, and the man she had helped him remember he could be. "I'm saying that love doesn't always look like what we think it should look like. Sometimes it looks like letting someone go so they can become who they're meant to be. Sometimes it looks like being patient enough to trust that if something is meant to last, it will find a way." Maria leaned forward until their foreheads touched, and Richard could feel her breath against his skin. "And sometimes it looks like two broken people helping each other remember how to be whole." They sat like that for a long moment, surrounded by the ghosts of all the conversations that had brought them to this point. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles. But inside the diner, time seemed suspended. "I love you," Maria whispered, the words so soft he almost missed them. "I love you too," Richard replied, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "But more than that, I believe in you. I believe in the work you're going to do, the lives you're going to change, the teacher and leader you're going to become." The next morning, Richard stood at his office window, watching Maria's taxi disappear into the morning traffic that would carry her to the airport and then to her new life at Columbia. The locket lay warm against his chest, Elena's final gift continuing to guide him toward the man she had always known he could become. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Thank you for seeing who I could be before I could see it myself. Thank you for showing me what love looks like when it's strong enough to let go. I'll make you proud." Richard smiled, typing back, "You already have. Now go change the world." Over the next 2 years, Richard threw himself into expanding the Foundation's work with a passion that surprised even him. Without Maria's daily presence, he had to learn to make decisions on his own again, but now those decisions were guided by principles she had helped him rediscover: empathy, justice, the fundamental belief that every person deserved a chance to reach their full potential. The Foundation grew beyond even their most ambitious early dreams. They opened branch offices in 6 major cities, partnered with over 50 educational institutions, and created a network of support services that had helped thousands of people escape the cycles of poverty and despair that had once seemed unbreakable. Richard found himself testifying before Congress about educational inequality, speaking at conferences about the intersection of private philanthropy and public policy, being interviewed by journalists who wanted to understand how a ruthless businessman had transformed into one of the country's most effective advocates for social justice. But the work that mattered most to him remained the small personal interventions, the individual stories of transformation that reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. There was Marcus, the former gang member who used a Foundation scholarship to become a social worker in the neighborhood where he had once sold drugs. There was Linda, the refugee who parlayed Foundation support into a nursing degree and now ran a clinic serving her immigrant community. There were dozens of others, each story a thread in the tapestry of hope that Richard and Maria had begun weaving together. Richard still lived alone in his penthouse, but loneliness was no longer his constant companion. He had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between solitude and isolation. His apartment became a gathering place for foundation staff and scholarship recipients, his dining room table more likely to be covered with grant applications than business contracts. Maria called every Sunday, their conversations a highlight of his week. She shared stories from her classes, her research into education policy, her growing network of fellow advocates and reformers. Richard could hear the confidence growing in her voice, the way her natural warmth was being tempered by strategic thinking and policy expertise. She was becoming exactly what he had known she could be, a force for change on a scale that would have been impossible if she had remained trapped by her circumstances. "I've been thinking about something," she said during one of their Sunday calls as her graduation approached. "About what comes next." "What about it?" Richard asked, though his heart had started beating faster at the tone in her voice. "I've had some amazing job offers, think tanks, policy organizations, even a position with the Department of Education. But there's only one place I really want to be." Richard closed his eyes, hardly daring to hope. "Where's that?" "Home, with you. With the foundation, ready to take our work to the next level." The day Maria returned to New York, Richard felt like a man who had been holding his breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. He met her at the airport, and the moment he saw her walking through the arrivals gate, he understood that everything had changed, and nothing had changed at all. She was still Maria, still kind, still compassionate, still capable of seeing the best in everyone she met. But now there was something more, a confidence and authority that made her even more beautiful than she had been when she left. "You look different," she said as they embraced, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Different how?" Richard asked, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Happier, more settled. Like you've figured out who you are when I'm not around to remind you." Richard pulled back to look at her, marveling at the woman she had become. "I figured out that I'm someone who can love completely and let go completely, and that those aren't contradictory things. I figured out that the best gift I can give someone I love is the space to become who they're meant to be." Maria smiled, the expression that had first captured his heart all those years ago in Murphy's Diner. "And I figured out that home isn't a place. It's the person who believes in your best self, even when you've forgotten what that looks like." That evening, they found themselves back in Murphy's Diner, sitting in the same booth where their story had begun. The diner looked exactly the same, but they were profoundly different people than they had been that first night. Richard was no longer the lonely billionaire seeking connection, and Maria was no longer the struggling waitress dreaming of a different life. They had become partners in the truest sense, two people who had helped each other grow into their full potential. "So," Maria said, spreading her plans for the foundation's next phase across the familiar table, "are you ready to change the world?" Richard looked at the woman across from him, at the dreams and strategies and possibilities laid out between them, at the future they were going to build together. He touched the locket at his throat, feeling Elena's presence like a warm benediction, and smiled. "I've been ready my whole life," he said. "I just needed someone to show me how." 5 years later, Richard stood at the podium of the United Nations, addressing a global summit on education and economic opportunity. In the audience, he could see Maria in the front row, her face glowing with pride and love. Behind her sat Tom, now the Foundation's executive director, and dozens of other scholarship recipients who had become leaders in their own communities. The Elena Blackwood Foundation had become a model for effective philanthropy worldwide, its innovative approaches to education and economic empowerment being replicated on every continent. But for Richard, the true measure of their success wasn't in the statistics or the awards or the global recognition. It was in moments like this, when he could look out at an audience filled with people whose lives had been transformed by the simple act of seeing their potential and giving them the tools to reach it. My grandmother once told me that we're all just walking each other home, Richard said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast assembly hall. She taught me that the purpose of success is not to separate us from our fellow human beings, but to give us the power to lift them up alongside us. The foundation that bears her name exists because she understood something that I forgot for many years, that we are only as strong as the weakest among us, and we are only as successful as our willingness to share that success with others. After the speech, as delegates and activists crowded around him with congratulations and questions, Richard felt a familiar hand slip into his. Maria had made her way through the crowd to stand beside him, and he felt that sense of completeness that had become his constant companion whenever she was near. "Elena would be proud," she whispered in his ear, as they smiled for photographs and shook hands with world leaders. "She would be proud of both of us," Richard replied, his fingers automatically finding the locket that still hung around his neck after all these years. That night, as they walked along the East River with the lights of Manhattan glittering across the water, Maria took his hand and stopped walking. "There's something I need to tell you." Richard turned to face her, noting the nervous excitement in her expression. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position, Secretary of Education. The President wants me to lead a national initiative based on our foundation's work." Richard felt his heart swell with pride and something else, a deep, abiding joy at seeing the woman he loved step into the fullness of her power and purpose. "Maria, that's incredible. That's everything you've worked for." It would mean moving to Washington. It would mean stepping back from the day-to-day work of the foundation. It would mean... She paused, looking uncertain for the first time since her return from Colombia. "It would mean changing the entire country the same way we changed individual lives," Richard finished for her. "It would mean taking Elena's wisdom to the highest levels of government. It would mean fulfilling the destiny I've been watching you grow into since the day we met." Maria searched his face, looking for any sign of the old fears and possessiveness. "You really want me to take it, don't you?" "I want you to take it because it's what you're meant to do. I want you to take it because the country needs leaders who understand that education is about hope, not just knowledge. I want you to take it because Elena raised me to recognize greatness when I see it, and to do everything in my power to help that greatness flourish." Maria stepped closer, her hands coming up to frame his face. "And what about us? What about everything we've built together?" Richard smiled, feeling the peace that had become his constant companion whenever he faced a moment that would have terrified the old version of himself. "We've built something that's bigger than geography, stronger than distance. We've built a love that's based on helping each other become our best selves, not on holding each other back. The foundation will continue the work. I'll continue the work. And you'll be doing the same work on a scale that will touch millions of lives. You're not going to ask me to stay. I'm not going to ask you to be anything less than everything you're capable of being," Richard replied. "That's what love looks like when it's healthy and strong and rooted in something deeper than need." 2 months later, Richard stood in the crowd at Maria's swearing-in ceremony, watching as she placed her hand on the Bible and took the oath that would make her one of the most powerful people in American education. The woman who had once struggled to pay for community college classes was now in a position to reshape educational opportunity for an entire generation. During her speech, Maria's eyes found his in the crowd, and she smiled the same smile that had first captured his heart in a humble diner on the other side of the city. "This work is not mine alone," she said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "It belongs to everyone who has ever believed that education is the great equalizer, that opportunity should not be determined by the circumstances of your birth, that every human being deserves the chance to reach their full potential. It belongs to my grandmother, who taught me that kindness is the most powerful force in the world, and it belongs to a woman I never met but whose wisdom has guided every step of my journey. Eleanor Blackwood, who understood that we are all responsible for walking each other home. As the crowd erupted in applause, Richard felt tears streaming down his face, not tears of sadness, but of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Elena's legacy lived on, not just in the foundation that bore her name, but in every life that had been transformed by the ripple effects of her wisdom. That evening, at the celebration dinner, Richard found himself thinking about the man he had been that first night at Murphy's Diner. Lonely, cynical, convinced that human connection was impossible in a world driven by greed and self-interest. That man had been given a gift he couldn't have imagined, the chance to discover that love and purpose were not just possible, but inevitable when you had the courage to remain open to them. The Elena Blackwood Foundation continued to thrive under Tom's leadership, with Richard serving as chairman emeritus and largest donor. He split his time between New York and Washington, supporting Maria's work while continuing to expand the foundation's global reach. Their relationship had evolved into something he hadn't known existed, a partnership that transcended traditional categories, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love deep enough to encompass whatever form their connection needed to take. On quiet Sunday evenings, they would often find themselves back at Murphy's Diner, sitting in their old booth and talking about the work they were doing, the lives they were touching, the world they were slowly but steadily changing. The diner had become a kind of shrine to their journey, the place where two lonely people had found each other and discovered that healing the world began with healing themselves. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped here that night? Maria asked during one of these visits, her hand wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Richard considered the question, his fingers unconsciously touching the locket that still hung around his neck. I think Elena would have found another way to bring us together. I think she's been orchestrating this from the beginning, arranging all the pieces so that when we were ready, we would find each other. You think she knew that we would fall in love? Richard smiled, remembering his grandmother's uncanny ability to see into people's hearts and futures. I think she knew we would save each other. The love was just how we were going to do it. As they sat in the familiar surroundings, surrounded by the echoes of all the conversations that had shaped their journey, Richard felt the deep contentment that comes from a life lived in alignment with its purpose. He had found his way back to the boy Elena had raised, but he had also become something more, a man who understood that true success was measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives transformed, not in power wielded, but in hope restored. The locket around his neck had become warm against his skin, as it always did in moments of profound gratitude. Inside, his parents' wedding photograph continued to remind him that love was indeed the only thing that truly lasted. But Elena's note had proven prophetic in ways she couldn't have imagined. He had remembered who he was meant to be, but more than that, he had discovered who he was capable of becoming when love and purpose aligned. Years passed, and the work continued to grow and evolve. The foundation established programs in over 30 countries. Maria's education initiatives became models for reform around the world, and the principles Elena had taught, that kindness was power, that we are all responsible for each other, that love expressed through service was the highest form of human achievement, spread like ripples across the globe. Richard and Maria never married in the traditional sense, but their partnership transcended conventional definitions. They had become something rare and beautiful, two people who had helped each other become their highest selves, whose love was expressed not through possession, but through liberation, not through dependency, but through mutual empowerment. On the 10th anniversary of that first night at Murphy's Diner, they organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose life had been touched by their work. Scholarship recipients who had become doctors and teachers and social workers, community leaders who had used foundation resources to transform entire neighborhoods, policymakers who had implemented programs based on the foundation's research. Hundreds of people gathered to honor not just Richard and Maria, but Elena's enduring legacy. Tom, now in his 50s, and one of the most respected voices in community development, served as master of ceremonies. 10 years ago, he said, addressing the crowd gathered in the hotel ballroom that had been donated for the event, a lonely man walked into a diner and met a struggling young woman, and neither of them could have imagined that their friendship would change thousands of lives. But that's the thing about love. Real love, the kind that seeks the good of the other above all else. It multiplies exponentially. Every person in this room is here because two people chose connection over isolation, service over selfishness, hope over cynicism. As the evening progressed, speaker after speaker shared stories of transformation, of opportunities seized and dreams realized, of communities rebuilt and futures reclaimed. Richard listened to each testimony with wonder, still amazed by the vast network of positive change that had grown from such a simple beginning. But the moment that moved him most deeply came when Sarah Chen, the single mother who had been one of their first scholarship recipients, took the stage. Now, Dr. Sarah Chen, head of pediatrics at a major hospital, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her calling. Mr. Blackwood and Secretary Rivera gave me more than financial support, she said, her voice clear and strong. They gave me something I had almost lost, the belief that my dreams mattered, that my struggles had purpose, that someone saw potential in me even when I couldn't see it in myself. But most importantly, they showed me what love looks like, when it's not about taking but about giving, not about holding on but about letting go, not about making someone smaller so you can feel bigger, but about helping them grow into their full magnificence. Richard felt Maria's hand find his under the table, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their signature expression of connection. They had learned to love each other in the truest sense, not as incomplete people seeking completion through another person, but as whole people choosing to share their wholeness in service of something greater than themselves. The evening ended with Richard taking the stage one final time, the locket visible now outside his formal shirt, catching the light as he moved. The crowd quieted as he approached the microphone. Hundreds of faces turned toward him with expressions of gratitude and affection. "When I was 8 years old," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "my grandmother gave me a locket and a promise. She told me that love was the only thing that truly lasted, and that if I held on to that truth, it would guide me through whatever darkness life might bring. I lost that locket for many years, along with my faith in the promise that came with it. But love has a way of finding us when we need it most, often in forms we don't expect." He looked out at the sea of faces, each one representing a life that had been touched by the power of purposeful love, and felt Elena's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside him on the stage. 10 years ago, a young woman handed me back more than just a piece of jewelry. She handed me back my grandmother's wisdom, my parents' hope, my own capacity for connection and service. She reminded me that we are all walking each other home, and that the journey is infinitely more beautiful when we choose to travel it together. Richard's eyes found Maria's in the crowd, and she smiled at him with the same radiance that had first captured his attention all those years ago. But now, it was enhanced by the confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was meant to contribute to the world. The Elena Blackwood Foundation will continue its work long after Maria and I are gone, because we built it on something stronger than individual personalities or even individual relationships. We built it on the understanding that human beings are capable of extraordinary goodness when we see ourselves clearly, when we recognize our interdependence, when we choose to use whatever power we have in service of lifting others up. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. He was looking at Maria, at Tom, at all the faces of people who had become family through the bonds of shared purpose, and feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from a life aligned with its highest calling. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and the guests began to disperse, Richard found himself alone with Maria on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out over the city lights that stretched to the horizon. The locket lay warm against his chest, Elena's final gift continuing to guide him toward ever deeper understanding of what it meant to live a life of meaning. "Any regrets?" Maria asked, leaning against the railing beside him. Richard considered the question seriously. The man he had been 10 years ago, lonely, cynical, convinced that human connection was impossible, felt like a character from someone else's story. The journey from that darkness to this light had required him to lose almost everything he thought mattered and discover everything that actually did. "Only one," he said finally. Maria raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That Elena didn't get to meet you, that she didn't get to see what we built together." Richard smiled, his hand moving unconsciously to the locket. "But then again, maybe she did. Maybe she's been watching all along, making sure her two favorite people found their way to each other when the time was right." Maria moved closer, her shoulder touching his as they stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that the highest form of love was the willingness to help another person become their best self, even when it meant letting them go, even when it meant changing everything. Even when it meant risking the kind of vulnerability that could break your heart or remake your soul. The city hummed with life below them, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles, their own journeys toward connection and purpose. Somewhere out there, Richard knew, were other lonely billionaires and struggling waitresses, other people who had lost their way, and others who held the keys to guide them home. The work would continue, the love would multiply, and Elena's wisdom would ripple outward through generations yet unborn. As they stood together under the stars, Richard felt the profound peace that comes from knowing your life has mattered, from understanding that love is indeed the only thing that truly lasts, and from recognizing that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the chance to become who you were always meant to be. The locket pulsed warm against his heart, and in its steady rhythm, Richard could hear the echo of Elena's voice, still guiding him home after all these years. "We're all just walking each other home, my boy. We're all just walking each other home."